Thomas Hobbes and Social Contract Theory, or SCT. Let's begin with some history, since Hobbes' historical context influences views greatly. What we can collectively call the wars of religion, for example, the French Wars of Religion, or the 30 Years' War, etc., were fresh in everyone's mind when Hobbes was forming his views. Moreover, since there was no clear victor to these wars, people had to live with considerable ideological conflict within their borders. This is to say that Protestants and Catholics, for the time being, had to try to peacefully coexist. Into this context came the resurgence of an ancient skeptic ideal, cultivating ataraxia. Ataraxia is an ideal state of mind where one achieves a complete suspense of belief, and which ancient schools of philosophy, for example, Pyrrhonism and Stoicism, taught would help one achieve serene calmness. Interesting sidebar, ancient philosophers began to truly argue for ataraxia once the independence of Greek city-states could no longer rationally be expected. First, after the pretty decisive conquest by Alexander and his father, Philip II, and later, of course, by the Romans when Augustus defeated Cleopatra. In other words, given the human desire for cognitive peace and that the more martial values of conquest that the Greeks used to hold on to were no longer realistic, Greeks turned towards conquering themselves, sort of as a way to end cognitive dissonance and come to terms with their new subordinate status. In any case, why were 17th century European intellectuals in pursuit of ataraxia? The answer is this. This was many intellectuals' way of dealing with the ideological hornet's nest that they were forced to live in. The practical result of ataraxia, once you achieve it, is the lack of emotional involvement in, anything. They realized they couldn't fix anything, and they sought some sort of intellectual escape. The philosopher Justus Lipsius, 1547 to 1606, was an example of this resurgent skepticism, as was Michel de Montaigne, pictured here. Here you can hear what we can perhaps call Montaigne's spiritual struggle. What goodness is that which but yesterday I saw in credit and esteem, and tomorrow to have lost all reputation, and that the crossing of a river is made a crime? What truth is that which these mountains bound, and is a lie in the world beyond them? These skeptics also cast a doubt on the wisdom of the Aristotelian worldview, one which had dominated for 1,000 years. Not only did they point out that the existence of optical illusions cast doubt on the reliability of sensory perception, thereby undermining Aristotelian science, but they stressed that, given the diversity of ethical belief in the world that Europeans were becoming aware of, Aristotle was simply mistaken in arguing for the universality of the middle-class Athenian virtues of his day and in which he was so confident. In short, people were losing faith in ancient wisdom and in our capacity as humans to understand the world we live in. René Descartes, for one, argued against these skeptics, attempting to restore some sort of deductive certainty to our relationship with knowledge about the world. Descartes' story is covered in my Philosophy 101 course, so I won't get into that here. What we can say though is this. Hobbes, like many, was dissatisfied with Descartes' answer. Hobbes, unlike many others though, gave it the old college try himself. Before getting into Hobbes though, we should mention perhaps the most important influence on his thought, the work of Hugo Grotius, a Dutch lawyer and philosopher. Grotius' philosophy had 3 points of relevance for understanding Hobbes' work. Number 1, Grotius converted language of self-preservation to language of moral right. That is, he found a way to converge something I think we all agree with, that we have the right to defend ourselves, with morality. Grotius did this without talking about God. That's number 2. In other words, he did so in a secular way. And number 3, Grotius discussed something like the state of nature, a condition under which humanity has no central authority to manage social order. This last point will be very important for understanding Hobbes. Grotius' minimalist theory of human rights, that all we have the right to do is preserve ourselves, led to very illiberal views. Under this way of thinking, for example, both voluntary slavery, such as in the case where you take on a master due to an extreme need for food and shelter, and giving up all civil rights to a monarch to achieve some sort of social peace, were rational and justifiable. In short, Grotius' views made way for accepting something like enlightened despotism, an authoritarian regime where the monarch is supposed to be, all things being equal, enacting policies that benefit the populace and which they would not have done on their own. Perhaps an example of this is Russia's Catherine the Great. In any case, Grotius' philosophy significantly influenced Hobbes' ethics. Grotius believed that an equilibrium of violence is necessary for social life. If too little violence were permitted, then people wouldn't be able to defend themselves. If too much violence were permitted, social life would be impossible. Hobbes' ethics. Hobbes wanted to defend many of Grotius' ideas. To do this, he actually first defended moral relativism. In his The Elements of Law, Hobbes argued that moral terms were just like color terms. The fact that we see red things around us and we all refer to the color with our word red makes it easy to imagine that there really is something like redness itself, independent of humans. But this is just a fantasy, says Hobbes. The same is the case with good or goodness. It is only our shared usage of a common language that makes it seem like there is an objective good. But just like the fantasy that there really is something like redness, the existence of good is also a fantasy. There is only good for you, good for me, etc. Hobbes further argued that our moral approval came from the positive feelings of pleasure. Thus, in a nutshell, he equated good and pleasure, a view that we're referring to here as hedonism, and he seems to have done this throughout his entire life. As we've seen, Glaucon seems to have been assuming something like this too. It was actually only until Hume entered the picture, a century later, that these two concepts were disentangled, or at least it was argued that they should be. Stay tuned for that. Like Glaucon, Hobbes seems to be assuming that it is rational and right to behave in one's own self-interest. Although this view goes by many names, for example, rational choice theory, the theory of self-love, etc., we'll be referring to it as psychological egoism. In short, people are motivated purely by self-interest. However, we should make an important point here about Hobbes' notion of self-interest and self-preservation. Hobbes is sometimes characterized as overly pessimistic. That he was pessimistic is without question, but we shouldn't oversell this point. Hobbes didn't think that people wanted to harm each other for the sake of harming each other. People want power and influence over others, sure, but mostly only so as to ensure their own survival. Ultimately, though, given his views on how moral approval arises, Hobbes was actually the most concerned with conflict over moral terms. In other words, he was concerned over something like the wars of religion happening again, where the casus belli was over the right way to worship. Hobbes figured that the malleability of public opinion by outside forces was part of this problem. He wanted to find a way to not let public opinion become belligerent again. In particular, over incompatible moral judgments. This, by the way, seems depressingly relevant today. And so Hobbes believed that politics was a solution to this moral problem. He lays out his solution in The Elements of Law, which I'll read in its entirety, since it is an excellent summary of Hobbes' views. In the state of nature where every man is his own judge, and differeth from other concerning the names and appellations of things, and from those differences arise quarrels and breach of peace, it was necessary there should be a common measure of all things that might fall in controversy, as, for example, of what is to be called a right, what good, what virtue, what much, what little, what meum and tuum, what a pound, what a quart, etc. For in these things private judgments may differ and beget controversy. This common measure, some say, is right reason, with whom I should consent if there were any such thing to be found or known in rerum natura. But commonly, they that call for right reason to decide any controversy do mean their own. But this is certain, seeing right reason is not existent, the reason of some man or men must supply the place thereof, and that man or men is he or they that have the sovereign power, as hath been already proved. And consequently the civil laws are to all subjects the measures of their actions, whereby to determine whether they be right or wrong, profitable or unprofitable, virtuous or vicious, and by them the use and definition of all names not agreed upon and tending to controversy shall be established. As, for example, upon the occasion of some strange and deformed birth, it shall not be decided by Aristotle or the philosophers whether the same be a man or no, but by the laws. In a nutshell, this is Hobbes' view. In the state of nature, people have a right to defend themselves. But people need to make their own decisions about when they are at risk and when it is appropriate to defend themselves. Moreover, human psychology being what it is, we are likely to get this wrong sometimes. So there is a radical instability built into the state of nature. The state of nature thus becomes a state of war, and this is what gets us into Hobbes' politics. The ethical dilemma just outlined compels us to accept the judgment of a common authority, so that less or no moral conflict exists. Importantly, there is no fact of the matter on moral judgments, so there is no reason to prefer our own judgments to another's. The best case scenario, says Hobbes, is to find some single source of opinion whose views about the danger to each of them in doubtful or contentious cases they will accept. In other words, Hobbes thought we should give all authority on moral and legal matters to a central sovereign, and they will rule impartially. They will find whatever laws that stabilize social order, and they will punish those that break the laws, and only in this way will there be peace. The state, by the way, will have no ideological axe to grind, unlike the authoritarian regimes that modern-day liberals and conservatives fear. It will simply find a set of laws that are balanced, such that there is social order and stability, and enforce them. Sidebar: interestingly, rebellion is justified, according to Hobbes, only if the lives of the subjects are at stake. In other words, only for self-preservation. This is a result of Grotius's and Hobbes's minimalist theory of rights. You only have the right to self-preservation. So technically, under Hobbes's way of looking at things, rebellion is okay in the case of some 20th century dictatorships because, well, their lives really were at risk. Okay, there are plenty of criticisms to give, and we will in due time. For now, let's just consider these. Number one, Hobbes didn't do anything to discuss the free rider problem. So, how did society deal with those that sought to take more than they gave? Hobbes is silent on the question. Even Hobbesian scholar Richard Tuck admits that there is no real solution to find in Hobbesian texts. See Tuck 2002, page 79 to 80. Also, Hobbes tended to gloss over possible conflicts of interest between the sovereign, right, the dictator, the monarch, and the subjects. Obviously, though, given the brutal authoritarian regimes from the 20th century, some of which still exist, this is something we'd like an ethical theory to discuss. Let's briefly discuss Hobbes' view on religion since they link to the next lesson. Hobbes used the label God as a materialist, essentially making the case that only physical substances exist. No non-physical souls, no non-physical gods, it's all physical. The Hobbesian scholar Richard Tuck mentions that Hobbes would have likely been okay with calling the Big Bang God. You can see Tuck 2002, page 89 for that. Hobbes basically saw religion as a means for stability. The sovereign would either enforce some religion that was conducive to social order, or give subjects a free choice between the beliefs which the sovereign allowed to compete with each other. Sort of a free market of religions once the religions have been approved by the monarch. It's a very strange idea, but clearly Hobbes saw religion, if chosen well, as a sort of social glue that might serve to cohere the populace. To kind of wrap things up, Hobbes is definitely a paradox. He praised toleration, yet he advocated an absolute sovereign with total power over intellectual matters. Interesting.